this have to be up to work?
Not generally. Did it work?
It worked in, yes.
Okay.
This thing's dead for some reason. That's odd.
I think we're ready to roll today. First, a couple of announcements. The first one is, please take out your cell phones. And turn them off, please. In the vernacular of the day, ditch these too. Okay, so we'll have everybody's attention. Thank you very much. I'd like to remind you, unfortunately, being the bearer of bad news, to remember to bring blue books to your section this week that we're going to have our midterm. We'd also like to remind you that your two notable quotes are due by the 27th, or the 21st. No. Not this week, but next week. You have to have had two notable quotes submitted. So one, if you haven't submitted any, one's due this week and the other one's due next week. And if you have one in, then all you have is one more left. And if you have two in,
You can study for the
you can study for the midterm. And if you have three in, you made a mistake handing it back to you. Because it's two in front of the midterm and two after. I want to remind you about the showing of The Nasty Girl, which is going to take place. I think if you see it, it will enlighten you in terms of being able to enjoy the lecture by Anna Rasmus, who will be here on the 27th. I would like to encourage you to get here early that day because there will be people from outside of the lecture series, a significant number of people who will be coming to see her, including students from the German department, as well as people connected with Associated Students Productions, and we are advertising it heavily. So get here early so that you can have your seat. And now I come to something that always is very special for me because we have built up a relationship with our speaker, Jerry Fowler, who is quite a distinguished fellow, but you would never know it talking to him. Jerry Fowler is a lawyer. He has experience working in human rights. He is the director of the Committee on Conscience from the Holocaust Museum in Washington. Currently on leave and serving Claremont McKenna as the distinguished visiting professor in the philosophy department. And not only is he a distinguished visiting professor, he is a distinguished visiting lecturer. And he's come to talk to us today about, and the title of his lecture is From Bosnia to Darfur. So would you all welcome Jerry? Thank you.
Thank you, Myrna. I appreciate that. I'm still processing that idea that I'm distinguished, but you would never know it to actually talk to me. Yeah, the guy seems so mediocre, but I'm told he's distinguished. But no, I appreciate it, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here again. I've been coming here for a number of years, and 6 years. Oh, well, who's counting?
It's
Okay.
hissing.
It's hissing. Yeah, I was doing that when you were here.
Try that.
Okay. Can you still hear me? All right. So I always look forward to coming. Last year, I have to say, when I came, there were rains of biblical proportions. And I think that's the only time I've come that the weather really wasn't very nice. But so I'm very pleased to have this California weather. I thought when you said everyone pull out your cell phones, that what you were going to have them do is call President Bush and say, stop the genocide now. Maybe you can do that like at a future class. And this is kind of jumping ahead in my whole talk, but this is something that I've always encouraged students to do. For those of you who are working on the Darfur issue, and I see some t-shirts and stuff, everyone's got cell phones. Everyone has free long distance. I imagine most of you use up your minutes, but some people may even have extra minutes. And just set up out in some area and get a list of members of Congress from around here and the White House and ask people to take a few minutes to make a phone call. And they can just do it while they're there, either with their phone or you can give them a phone. So you might even try that in this class before you finish. Well, what I wanted to talk today about is I'm going to try to cover a fair amount of ground. As Myrna said, the kind of working title of this is International Responses to Genocide from Bosnia to Darfur, but I'm going to cover more ground than that. But what I wanted to start with is actually with Darfur, kind of starting with the end of the story. And previously when I've come here the last couple of years, I've spent the whole talk almost on Darfur. And I'm not going to do that today. I'm going to just spend a few minutes on Darfur. But I want to get you oriented in a very concrete situation, because then I'm going to talk a little bit more broadly and a little bit more abstractly, looking back over the last 50 years, and try to explain how we've gotten to the point where we are on Darfur, where we've got human destruction on a massive scale, and a seeming widespread agreement that this can't be tolerated, but yet we're tolerating it. The world is tolerating it. Why is that? And I won't be able to answer the why in the more philosophical sense, but I will try to answer the why in more of a political sense to give you an idea of why the world is working the way it is or not working the way it is. But I want to start by just orienting you towards Darfur. Darfur is a region in Sudan. Sudan is the largest country in Africa. To give you a sense of how large it is about the size of the United States east of the Mississippi. So this is a huge country. And unlike the United States east of the Mississippi, where we have a whole lot of roads, we've got the interstate system, you've got states, you've got county roads, you don't have a whole lot of infrastructure in Sudan as a whole, and especially very little infrastructure in Darfur. Darfur, as you can see, is kind of on the western reaches of Sudan. To give you an idea of how isolated it is, there's really just one road that connects it to the capital of Khartoum and one railroad track. So even getting from Khartoum to Darfur is quite a chore, and generally people who are going there nowadays are flying. Darfur itself is a very large area. It's often said it's about the size of Texas or the size of France. And I have to say, I actually grew up in Texas, so you say something's the size of Texas, you think it's really big. Actually, Texas is not that much bigger than California. So Darfur is about the size of California. And I don't have time to go, and I won't spend time going into all of the details of Darfur, It is a very complex situation, and I hope that as you're learning about different situations, you're coming to appreciate their complexity and the uniqueness that they all have. But at the same time, there are certain moral contours to the situation that are similar to moral contours of situations that the world has faced in the past. And let me just outline the moral contours in Darfur. Over the course of the past 3 to 4 years now, hundreds of thousands of people have perished. They've died. Many of them have been murdered outright. Many of them have died because of the conditions of life that have been inflicted upon them. And I'm going to show you in just a minute what I mean by that. But basically, if you see Darfur there, think about the Mojave Desert. It's largely desert. It's a very, desert in a generic sense. It's a very dry area. And people have been driven from their homes out into the desert where they cannot survive without outside assistance. And to varying levels over the course of the past 3 to 4 years, the government of Sudan has been impeding that humanitarian assistance that people need to survive. So a lot of the deaths that you hear about in Darfur are from the conditions of life that have been inflicted upon them. So as I say, hundreds of thousands of people have died. We don't know the exact number, and sometimes you get people argue about this. Well, is it 200,000? Is it 400,000? We don't know. There's no way to know. There's actually not very much access to Darfur. Journalists can go in on a limited basis and interview people and come out, but you can't travel through the area. It is so insecure. And so we may never know how many people have died, but we feel pretty confident that it's definitely in the hundreds of thousands. In addition to that, some 2 million people have been driven from their homes. So in addition to the hundreds of thousands who have died, about 2 have been driven from their homes. Basically, their villages have been burnt down, and I'll show you what I'm talking about in just a minute. And they're living really on the edge. I mean, their lives are hanging in the balance, even as I'm speaking to you today. Of those 2 million, the vast majority of them are still inside Darfur. They've kind of gathered in large, what are sometimes referred to as camps, but that really suggests more organization than there really is. But they've gathered together in conglomerations of people, some of them as many as 100,000 people kind of in makeshift structures outside larger towns and cities, or not really cities, but larger towns in Darfur to get shelter. About 200,000 of them have crossed over into neighboring Chad in refugee camps along the border. And the camps in Chad are run by the United Nations, and they are much more orderly now. They're not great places, no place that you would want to live, but they're at least more organized than the situation that people have in Darfur. And until the last 6 to 8 months, people in Chad were relatively safe because they had gotten out of Darfur. Unfortunately, one of the things that we've seen happening on an increasing basis is the violence is spilling over, and Chad itself is becoming very unstable. So now in Chad, within the last 6 months, something like 130,000 civilians, Chadian civilians, have been displaced from their villages. And a lot of the dynamic of the violence in Chad is similar to Darfur. It's got its own dynamic, but it's ethnic violence. Why is this happening? Again, very complex, but let me just give you the basics. In early 2003, a rebellion began in Darfur that called for greater access to national wealth and resources. One thing to have in your mind about Sudan as you look at this map is that the capital is in Khartoum, which you see is right along the Nile River. And that's traditionally been the source of power, the seat of power in this area. And on the peripheries, around the edges, such as Darfur, have been very marginalized from power and from wealth. One expert one time suggested you should think of Sudan as a big sink, and Khartoum is the drain, and everything flows down the drain. So these rebels in Darfur were basically, their demand was greater piece of the national pie, access to power, greater access to the national wealth. Unfortunately, over the course of the last, say, 20 years in Darfur, there had been local conflicts that revolved around access to land. Most of the economy in Darfur is based on the land. And you have people who are living farming the land, even though it's very dry, it's possible to at least subsistence farm. And then you had other groups, generally ethnically different, who were nomads, who would herd camels or cattle. And for a variety of reasons I won't go into, although in the question and answer period I'd be happy to expand on it further, those different lifestyles over the past couple of decades have gotten associated with different ethnic identity. And the ethnic identity of the nomadic groups tended to be expressed as being an Arab identity, and for the farmers and some semi-sedentary groups, they started to talk about themselves as African. Now this is a misnomer. Everyone who lives in Sudan is African, Africa. And these groups have intermarried. They've been there for a long time and they've intermarried, so there's not really any objective difference for the most part, but subjectively, this sense of a different identity, Arab and non-Arab, and then sometimes the non-Arab is referred to as African, was really crystallizing over the last 20 years, becoming a source of conflict. So when this rebellion began, the rebels were drawing their support from mostly from the non-Arab ethnic groups. And they were rebelling against the government, which is dominated in Khartoum by people who identify themselves as Arabs. And one little irony here that I won't really go into, but for the most part, the people who identify themselves as Arabs in Khartoum look down on the people who identify themselves as Arabs in Darfur. That's out in the country. That's the boondocks. Those are Hicks. But when this rebellion began, the government in Khartoum adopted as a strategy, basically, two key things. And this has all been very well documented. In fact, there was a new report that came out from the United Nations just on Monday. A high-level mission investigated this over the course of the last few months. And they basically confirmed what I'm about to tell you. The government adopted a strategy, one, of organizing, training, and arming militias from some of the Arab groups in Darfur to fight this rebellion. So that's number one, is organizing local militias from Arab groups and kind of emphasizing the sense of identity difference. And then the second thing that they did, and that they encouraged these militias to do, and often did in coordination with these militias, not to go after the rebels, but to go after the civilian bases of the rebels, or the perceived civilian base of the rebels. So they launched a campaign of destruction against the civilian populations of the non-Arab groups in Darfur. And those are the people who have been suffering disproportionately. When I say hundreds of thousands of people have been killed there or have died, they are civilians from these non-Arab groups, overwhelmingly. Villages have died, overwhelmingly non-Arab villages. People who are displaced, overwhelmingly non-Arab. And overwhelmingly, the responsibility for the violence has been on the part of the government and the militias that are allied with it. It's sometimes called Janjaweed, which is a local term meaning outlaw. But these guys aren't outlaws because the government's arming and training them. And one thing, I'll just drop a footnote here, as it were. There's a tendency sometimes to romanticize the rebels. It's certainly the case that the populations that the rebels came from and who were originally very sympathetic with the rebels are the ones who have been suffering. But unfortunately, rebels are not necessarily good guys either. They've also committed human rights abuses, they've killed people, but nothing on the scale compared to what the government has done and its Janjaweed or militia allies. Now, this is a picture that I took it was 3 years ago, it's hard to believe, but in Chad. I went to Chad, I've been to Chad twice along the border, visiting refugee camps, talking to refugees, collecting their stories. I haven't been able to go to Darfur. But this is what the terrain looks like, and this terrain, even though it's in Chad, extends into Darfur. And the time that I was on this trip was in May, and so the daily temperature in this area is about 110, 115, maybe 120 degrees. So when I say people have been driven from their villages, this is what they're driven into. They're not driven into the green hills of Sonoma at this time of year. They're driven into a harsh desert. Now, there is a rainy season, which happens later on, say starting in July and going till September. And just like the terrain around here, the terrain there softens a little bit. That's usually when they do their agriculture. But that's been one of the sources of problems, is that people are driven off the land during the dry season, and now for 3 years, 4 years in some cases, they haven't been able to plant. So the agricultural economy has basically collapsed. This is just a picture that was taken by a friend of mine who's an American ex-Marine who was with the small African Union monitoring force for a while that was supposed to be monitoring a ceasefire. And he said their joke was that that's what they did, was spend all their time looking for the ceasefire because they could never find it. Because there have been a number of ceasefires, a number of agreements. This is one thing that's very frustrating if you follow Darfur, or if you follow the Sudan for that matter, is that periodically there will be some agreement not to kill civilians, some agreement not to use airplanes to bomb civilians, which is something that they do a lot, some agreement to let in more humanitarian workers. Inevitably, all of these agreements are broken. And in fact, just one little example that I was writing about last night, this UN mission that I mentioned, they actually couldn't go to Sudan or Darfur, even though they were appointed by what's called the UN Human Rights Council. And the Secretary General of the United Nations, who just took office on the first time he met with the president of Sudan, he said, I'd like you to cooperate with this high-level mission. They want to just assess what's happening. And the president gave his personal commitment that the government would cooperate with this mission. And then over the course of the next 2 weeks, the mission asked for visas 20 times and couldn't get visas. And then even when they went back to Geneva, where they were based, they kept to meet with the government, and the government wouldn't meet with them. So this is a government that just routinely breaks its word. Anyway, this is a village. What the normal course of things is that militia, sometimes in coordination with the regular military, often the military actually would fly a plane over the village first and drop bombs on the civilians and get everybody running around. And when I'm telling you these stories, this has been documented by a lot of people. I talked to a lot of refugees who told very similar stories. But the bombs would maybe kill some people by running around, and then the troops on the ground, the militia and the military, would come in and start shooting people. And then people who weren't shot would flee. Women, if they were caught, would be often sexually assaulted, and I'll talk about that in just a minute, very briefly. And then after everyone was gone, the militias would loot the village, because their deal in here, one thing they were getting is the land, because they get all of these farmers off the land. The second thing they get is loot. And so they would collect everything they wanted to take away, and then they would burn the village, systematically burn it. And there you see a whole village going up in smoke. And this is happening time after time after time after time. Hundreds of villages all over Darfur have been destroyed. And in some cases, if security's gotten a little bit better, people might go back to where they came from, and they've been redisplaced. Some people have been displaced on more than one occasion. This looks like a trash heap. This is basically where displaced people were living inside Darfur. In some places it might be a little bit better. It depends upon if humanitarian organizations are able to get in and provide some plastic sheeting and provide more shelter. But in a lot of cases, and it's getting worse now, unfortunately, over the past 6 months, there's less and less humanitarian access, and people just make a shelter out of whatever they can. And you can just imagine the hygiene and the health problems associated with living under conditions like this. This was one woman I met on my first trip. When I went in May of 2004, people were still coming across the border. And this tree was really 100 yards from the border. It was very close to the border. And this was one of the bleakest places I've ever been. I mean, this was hot. It was about 120 degrees. And there was this stand of trees, which you can see the trees didn't have any leaves, but the branches at least provided some shelter. And so people had straggled across the border, and then they just plopped down here, and they were, at that point, living under the trees. For the most part, all of these people have been moved into camps on the Chad side of the border, so things are not as bad there as they were at this time. But in this one area, there were 10,000 people plopped down under trees. I mean, just many of them exhausted, many of them sick. All of their goats were dying because there wasn't any water. For the most part, they lost their livestock when their villages were attacked, but often they brought some goats with them, and so their last real property was just dying before their eyes. This woman was sitting under this tree, and you can see this is what she fled with: the blankets that she's sitting on, a few pots and pans that are stuck up in the tree. What you probably can't see as well is that she's got 2 bullet wounds in her right leg, one right below her right knee and one below her at the bottom of her right foot. And the story that she told me was that she was fleeing with about 60 other families from her village. And they're fleeing through this desert that you saw, or this desert-type terrain that you saw. And she and a 17-year-old girl went to a well to get water for themselves and the other refugees. And there was a soldier guarding the well. And you think about that for a minute. These people are driven into this hot, dry desert where water is life, and the government is guarding the wells. Well, they approached the well hoping that he would let them get some water, and the soldier grabbed the 17-year-old girl, and this woman tried to pull her back, and that's when the soldier shot her. And he took the girl away to a nearby army encampment. And the girl was found a couple of days later. She was still alive, but she was covered in blood, and both of her legs had been broken. And I mentioned that sexual assault has been part of this. In fact, in this UN report that just came out on Monday, the head of the commission, who is named Jody Williams, who won a Nobel Peace Prize about 10 years ago for leading the campaign to ban landmines. But she talked about being in a room with 30 refugee women kind of drawn at random, and I don't remember the exact number, but there were 9 stories of gang rapes among those 30 women. 7 of the women had experienced assaults themselves, and then 2 others had been close to someone who had been assaulted. So this use of sexual violence has been an integral part of the campaign. Civilians. Children are really bearing the brunt of it, as they often do. This was a little girl that I saw on my second visit. These are all orphans. The Red Cross, these are unaccompanied children, I should say, people who have ended up in Chad without adult family members. And the Red Cross has put up their pictures in all of these camps, hoping that maybe they can get reconnected with family members. This was a picture taken, as I said, by this ex-Marine, Brian Steidel. This girl was about one year old, and when her village was attacked, her mother was fleeing, and they often carry their babies on their backs. They wrap them up, and she was shot in the back. The mother was killed as well. The mother was killed, and then the baby had this wound that you can see, and they kept trying to give the baby to Brian because he was a white man. They thought he was a doctor, and he's just an ex-Marine, and he couldn't do anything except take the picture. And then the Red Cross went back the next day looking for the girl, and they couldn't find her. So he doesn't know to this day what happened to her. This is a little killed. You can see this was January of 2005. But the real peak of the violence was 2003, 2004, early 2005. It subsided for a while, and now in the last 6 months it's really started picking up. In some ways it's gotten more fragmented. It's not as organized as it was, but people still are at tremendous risk. This is a sandstorm, and I always use this picture because this is kind of the situation that the Darfurians find themselves in. They happen. This was taken in the middle of the day, and the wind had whipped up the sand, so you couldn't see more than a few hundred feet, and that's the way things are. Greater context to the international response, or lack of response, is this one. And this was a picture that I took on my first trip, and the thing that will always stay with me about meeting this man and these women is that I talked to these people, and they'd given me their story, and then as I was preparing to leave, the older gentleman made this gesture that you see, where he kind of folded his hands and he ducked his head, and he said, well, now this grandfather can be happy because I know somebody's taking our story back to America. And everywhere I went, people were so eager to share their stories, and the idea that if people knew what was happening to them, that there would be help. that there would be a response. And it particularly touched me because of many, many Holocaust survivors that I've met have talked about how they felt abandoned during the Holocaust. 60 years later, they still carry this feeling of abandonment. And what I saw when I went to Chad on both of my trips were people who were desperate not to feel abandoned. And as I said, this first trip was in 2004, the second one was in 2005, so we're talking about 3 years ago now, and 2 years ago now. And the situation is not better. The people are still very, very much on the edge, and there hasn't been an effective response. And so the question is why? As you probably know, in September of 2004, so that's well over 2.5 years ago, September of 2004, the Secretary of State of the United States, Colin Powell, he was the Secretary of State at the time, determined on behalf of the United States government that what was going on in Darfur was genocide. He used this term genocide. And I think there were a lot of people who believed that, one, if genocide is happening, that the nations of the world are obligated to respond and that they would respond. And that if the United States found something to be genocide, that would somehow make it a top priority of the United States government. Looking back now on 2.5 years since he made that determination, we see that that's not the case. And so what I want to turn to now is addressing the question of why not? Why not? Why is it that this determination of genocide did not transform people's response, and by people's I mean government's response to the situation in Darfur? So I think you can actually bring up the lights a little bit. I'm not going to come back to the slides in a little while. See if I can, well, we'll just leave the gentleman out, see him a little bit. Well, I want to take you back to 1945, to the end of World War II, and the end of what you've probably touched on in your class, for those of you who are in the class, the end of the Holocaust. And in many ways, that was a watershed period in human existence, that period at the end of the war, and as the truth of the Holocaust really became fully known. Now, of course, a lot of the truth was already known, especially in capitals and among governments, but it became publicly known with the end of the war. But if you think back to that time period, there were two big issues that world leaders were concerned about as they thought about creating a new world order after World War II, after the defeat of Nazi Germany and its allies in Japan. And those two big problems were first, and this was first in terms of priority, the problem of aggression, of one country invading another. And you'll remember the beginning of World War II was not Germany persecuting Jews within Germany. The beginning of World War II was Germany invading its neighbor, Poland, right, on September 1st, 1939. So as the war came to an end, that was seen as the preeminent problem, is to prevent aggression. How do you stop aggression? Only secondarily was there a concern, although it was a genuine concern, with the fact of massive human rights violations, including the destruction of the Jews, which was in some ways was the prime policy goal of the Nazi government, more than even getting more territory, was the destruction of Jews, which we today call the Holocaust. You know, it wasn't called the Holocaust until much later. But I'll just use the word Holocaust when I refer to it. But the historians always like to use the term that was extant at the time they're talking about. But you'll know what I'm talking about. But that was only second in importance to this problem of aggression. And in fact, you probably know that after the end of the war, the victorious allies, the United States, Great Britain, France, and Russia, put the top surviving Nazis on trial at Nuremberg. Nuremberg trial, very famous. And most people, maybe if I asked you, what do you think the Nuremberg trial was about? You unlucky person that I just called on. Yes, you? Oh, well, you're going to volunteer, okay. just Nuremberg? What was it about?
Just putting on trial the officers that were in charge of giving the orders to actually do the killing in the Holocaust.
Right. I mean, wrong, but right. No, that's what most people would answer is, well, Nuremberg was about putting on trial the people who were responsible for the Holocaust. But that wasn't really the main point of Nuremberg. It was a point. But the first crime that was charged against these people was what they called crimes against the peace. It was starting the war. It was aggression. They also included what was actually a fairly novel charge, which they called crimes against humanity. This category didn't really exist. There had been some references to it in law, but they created this category called crimes against humanity. And that's where they got at what we today call the Holocaust and other systematic attacks against civilians. But there was a very interesting thing about the way that they defined crimes against humanity in the charter that created the Nuremberg Tribunal. It wasn't just that the Nazis committed crimes against civilians, whether Jews or what other civilians. It was whether those crimes, that violence was committed in connection with the war. So think about that for a second, and this becomes a very important point. And this was very conscious, too. This wasn't an accident. That they did not charge the Nazis for doing anything against Jews before the war started in Germany. The only thing that made it a crime under the Nuremberg Charter to systematically attack civilians or kill civilians was that it was done in conjunction with an aggressive war. So the point that I'm trying to emphasize here is that while there was concern about the human rights violations, there was concern about the mass murder of Jews. It was obviously something very dramatic that had happened, and it pointed out just how barbaric the Nazis were. The main concern was that they had attacked their neighbors, that they had launched this aggressive war. And that was what the powers that were at the time really wanted to prevent from happening again. So at the same time that Nuremberg was being set up and the war was coming to an end, there was something else that was happening, and that was the creation of the United Nations. And today we take the United Nations for granted. It's been around a long time. We may not like it. But in 1945, it was brand new. And the kind of constitution of the United Nations was something called the UN Charter. And guess what the primary principle of the UN Charter was? A multiple choice test, okay? A, non-intervention in other countries, or B, protecting human rights. Non-intervention. All right, well, this class is going to do very well, I can tell. It's true, there were references to promoting human rights in the UN Charter, but they were fairly vague, and it was basically kind of aspirational. The rules UN Charter were about not using force except in two cases. There were really only two cases that force is allowed by one country against another under the UN Charter. One is in self-defense. So, I mean, every country's got the right to self-defense. Now, that can become very pliable. I mean, what's self-defense? You can take another course on that. But the second thing was Executive Committee of the United Nations. The most powerful countries were on it and had special powers. But if they decided that there was a threat to international peace and security, then they could authorize the use of force. So, for example, if, and this was used fairly soon after, in 1950, North Korea attacked South Korea. Now, of course, the South Koreans could defend themselves, although they weren't in a very good position to do that. But the Security Council determined that use of force was necessary to restore international peace and security, i.e., get the North Koreans out of South Korea. So they authorized all the countries of the world to join in a UN mission, which was led by the United States, to go and fight that war. Those are the only two things, self-defense and a UN Security Council under Chapter 7. And that was really the substantive heart of the UN Charter, not protecting human rights. Human rights was a second fiddle. What happened inside a country's own territory was there were certain standards that people were starting to talk about, but it wasn't really the business of outside countries. Now, there was one little exception to this in that time period. We're talking about 1945 and then in 1948. In 1948, two things happened that are significant for this topic. One is that the United Nations adopted something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So this was a tiny little step forward in articulating human rights standards. But the important thing to know about that is that it was a declaration. And this is the lawyer in me speaking. The declaration is just a statement of principles. It's not binding. So it didn't really obligate any government to protect human rights. It was just a declaration that this is a best practices, so to speak. But it was a little step forward. It was, in retrospect, an important step forward. The other thing that happened in 1948 is that the United Nations adopted what is in shorthand called the Genocide Convention. The Genocide Convention. And this word genocide was actually very new at the time. Have you studied how the word came about? Everyone knows Raphael Lemkin fled Poland, came up with the word genocide. And he was one of the moving forces behind the Genocide Convention. The full title of the genocide, could say, is the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Prevention and punishment. And those are going to be very important concepts. There are a couple of things that I want to emphasize about the Genocide Convention. The first is that it defined genocide, not in quite the same way Lemkin did. And I'm not going to go into the details, but just accept for now, we can talk about this in the Q&A, that the definition of genocide in the Genocide Convention was a very narrow definition. Very narrow definition, which did not talk about mass murder of civilians. Okay? It talked about specifically intending to destroy a group. Okay? So just to give you a very simplistic example, if you are a dictator and you murder 800,000 people, or, well, I won't use the numbers we're talking about in Darfur, you murder or cause the death of 200,000 people, but you don't intend to destroy the group, it's not genocide. You've got to specifically intend to destroy the group by undertaking that violence. Very narrow definition of genocide. Much different than crimes against humanity. Remember that idea, crimes against humanity? Crimes against humanity was really about a systematic attack against civilians. So it had to be kind of big, but you didn't have to intend to destroy the group. The second thing that was important about the Genocide Convention, which was a step forward, is that it did make genocide a crime, whether in times of war or peace. So this is kind of the camel's nose under the tent. You remember the rule that was basically set down in the UN Charter, which had existed before, it wasn't created then, but was articulated in the UN Charter, was that what happens inside a country's territory is its own business. And the Genocide Convention was a little step towards changing that, because it was saying that if you intend to destroy a group, even if it's inside your own territory, that's a crime under international law. Okay? Now, the weak thing about the Genocide Convention, the weakest thing about it is, it doesn't say what happens if you do that. Okay? The punishment part is spelled out in the Genocide Convention a little bit. It says that countries have to provide for it to be a crime to do this, and people who commit genocide will be tried by courts in the territory where the genocide is committed. It raises the prospect, which didn't happen for over 50 years, but the prospect of an international tribunal to try genocide. But it doesn't really have any other consequences beside that. There's a very vague statement that says that countries undertake to prevent genocide. Remember I said it was prevention and punishment of genocide? But what it means to prevent genocide is not spelled out at all. And in fact, it's not even clear if I'm the United States, for example, that I have any duty to prevent genocide in Darfur or in Rwanda or wherever. I mean, one reading of the thing is that a country signs on and undertakes a duty to prevent genocide in the territory under their control. It's pretty straightforward, but it doesn't say anything about what the obligation is of a country like the United States when genocide's happening someplace else. You might construct the argument that it's a broader duty than that, but it's not clear from the text. And remember the context in which this is 3 years after the UN Charter was adopted, which said that there will be no intervention in other countries, at least military intervention, except for self-defense or if authorized by the UN Security Council. So this was a context where the emphasis really was on non-intervention. But it did at least restrict what governments in theory could do to their own citizens. And in that sense, it was kind of a first. Well, that was in 1948, and I think that there were great hopes that somehow the Genocide Convention have a tremendous impact on responses to mass violence. But the fact is that for the next 50 years almost, or I should say 40 years really, for the next 40 years, it was a dead letter. The Genocide Convention was put on a shelf where it started gathering dust. And even professors who were very well versed in international law hadn't thought too much about the details of the Genocide Convention. What did it really mean? What were the intricacies of that definition? And it was never applied. And I won't go into all the situations, but there were a lot of situations between 1948 and let's say the end of the 1980s, 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, when there was mass violence that implicated the values of the Genocide Convention. I mean, you can have big arguments about whether they were genocide or not, but Biafra in Nigeria in the late 1960s, Burundi in 1972, Guatemala in the early 1980s, probably all places you've never even heard of. Places where people died, Bangladesh in 1971. Genocide Convention is not a factor. One thing that did happen, though, during that time period is that there were the increasing development of human rights norms. You remember I talked about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was a statement of principles. Well, those principles got put into more binding treaties. And I won't go into the details, but they dealt with topics such as civil and political rights, economic, cultural, and social rights. And there was a treaty to end racial discrimination, a treaty to end discrimination against women, all forms of discrimination against women, a convention on the rights of the child, a convention against torture. In 1975, there was an agreement that is sometimes called the Helsinki Agreement. This was during the Cold War, and without going into the details, the basic point was that it recognized that the treatment of governments, the treatment by governments of their own citizens was a subject of international concern. So what was happening slowly but surely in that time period, even though the Genocide Convention was on a shelf, the idea that the treatment of their own civilians was a matter of international concern was becoming more and more accepted. That basic arrangement that existed in 1945 of non-intervention, of kind of drawing, of saying that things that were of domestic concern were not subject to international efforts, was being chipped away. So, I mean, there may be things of domestic concern, but human rights was not one of them. Human rights becoming international. And individuals, it's sometimes said by law professors, were becoming subjects of international law. Before, only governments were subjects of international law. Now, people are starting to become subjects of international law. I should just say, very briefly, one reason that the Genocide Convention was put on a shelf was that basically anything that had to do with intervention in the period from 1948 to 1989 was seen through the prism of the Cold War, the conflict between the Soviet bloc and the West, or as we were happy to call it, the free world. And that kind of froze in place any international action to protect civilians. Things were either done by the West or they were done by the East. Everything that was done by one of those blocs was seen as part of its conflict with the other bloc. Well, in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. which symbolically ended the Cold War. And this was a time of incredible hope. The President of the United States at the time, who knows who the President of the United States was in 1989? You don't count. So, someone who probably wasn't born then. The elder Bush. Yes, the father of the current president. And he was talking about a new world order. And when he was talking about a new world order, he basically meant, well, an order where a lot of these treaties, including protection of human rights and preventing and punishing genocide, were actually given some teeth. A lot of very hopeful talk at that time. And you know, in August of 1990, Saddam Hussein, still in power then, invaded Kuwait. And the United States organized a UN response to that invasion. Now that was very traditional cross-border aggression, but even cross-border aggression from 1950, when the Korean War happened or started, till 1991, did not merit a UN response because of the Cold War. Well, because of the end of the Cold War, the United States was able to get everybody on board, and the UN responded to the invasion of Kuwait. And so there was the idea that, well, the UN could do all kinds of things. Now we will have international cooperation to protect borders and to protect human rights, because remember, this idea of human rights had become much more significant than it was in 1945. Well, those dreams were pretty quickly shattered by several experiences, which I'll go through very quickly. And I imagine you've talked about them some in the class. I don't know. But maybe the first in time would be the disintegration of the former Yugoslavia, which started falling apart in 1991, breaking up into its constituent parts. And then in 1991, we had the introduction of this euphemism, a euphemism, some say for genocide, euphemism for crimes against humanity, called ethnic cleansing. Okay, ethnic cleansing. So this was on the continent of Europe. You had people who were being attacked because of their ethnic identity. Tremendous amount of violence, murder and rape and displacement. And there were a lot of debates. Is this genocide or not? Does that mean we have to respond? Well, if it means we have to respond, we don't want to respond, let's don't talk about genocide. And things only got worse in 1992. The first part of the violence was really in Croatia. And then in April of 1992, the country of Bosnia declared its independence, and the violence just intensified. And over the course of the next 18 months, say 1992-93, somewhere in the neighborhood of 100,000 civilians were killed. And actually at the time, people thought it was even more, but 100,000 is pretty bad. And in August of 1992, there were images transmitted around the world of emaciated men behind barbed wire in Bosnia. They were Bosnian Muslims who had been burned, and then in part they weren't being fed. And so they had these haunting images that reminded people of the Holocaust. And so there's this extended debate, well, is this genocide? This looks like images from the Holocaust, and then that causes the other response, well, it's different in this way, it's different in that way. It became, the genocide debate became a substitute for actually doing anything, which governments basically didn't want to do. The United States government took the position, oh, this is a problem of Europe, so we'll let the Europeans deal with it. And the Europeans didn't really know what to do. And so the violence continued. There was kind of a half-hearted intervention, which ultimately turned out to make matters than helping them. That was 91, 92. At the end of 92, there was a crisis in Somalia, where many people were dying in Somalia, basically because of social collapse, and there was clan warfare. And in Somalia, it's very interesting. There was never even any question about whether it was genocide or not, but there was a lot of human suffering, and humanitarian relief that was being sent to try to help people who were in need was being diverted by warlords, by armed groups. And so there actually was a UN intervention in Somalia, not in response to genocide, but in response to humanitarian suffering. And that was an intervention that ultimately went very much awry. The United States got involved, And in October of 1993, how many people here have seen or heard of the movie Black Hawk Down? Okay, did you watch it in the class? Anyway, well, Black Hawk Down was set in Somalia in October of 1993, and basically showed where the United States Rangers got ambushed, 18 of them were killed, and that basically led the United States to say, oh, what are we doing here? Feeding these people is not worth the lives of our soldiers. And so the United States pulled out of Somalia. So that was number two. Number three was Rwanda in April of 1994. So about 7 months after the events in Black Hawk Down in Somalia. Violence began in April of 1994, massive violence. Very quickly it became clear that if there was anything that constituted genocide, this was genocide. I mean, ultimately what happened in 100 days, about 800,000 people were murdered. I mean, you think about that. That's 8,000 people per day. And it was not a straight line. I mean, most of the people were killed in the first 3 weeks. So the amount of violence was just incredible. And it was targeted against one particular group, the so-called Tutsi minority. And by the end of the violence, by the end of the genocide, 3 out of every 4 Tutsi in Rwanda had died. I mean, not died, had been murdered. 3 out of 4. So that was clearly genocide. But on the other hand, there was no will to intervene. The United States had just gotten its nose bloodied in Somalia, and the main slogan inside the United States government was "No more Somalias." And so one thing that happened was, as this violence was becoming clear, and within days to 2 weeks, the scope of it, the nature of it, was pretty obvious inside the government, if not outside, and it was being covered to some degree by the press. And so there was this very vigorous debate of, should we call it genocide? Well, if we call it genocide, maybe we'll have to do something. This idea that genocide convention, which had been on the shelf since 1948, that no one had much, although they had started to look at it again with regard to Bosnia, would require them to do something. And so the United States government in particular went out of its way to not say that what was happening was genocide. And there was no intervention. The genocide came to an end because there was a Tutsi-led rebel group that basically pushed the genocidaire out of the country. And then the final episode in the 1990s that I want to touch on was in 1999 in Kosovo, which was a province of Serbia, which was kind of the biggest part of the former Yugoslavia. And in that case, through 1998, there was mounting persecution of the Albanian ethnic group in Kosovo, which actually in that province was a majority. Again, there's a text to this that I'm not providing. But from the outside, it was basically mounting persecution against a specific ethnic group. And this time, the United States government in particular which had stood by, the same administration which had stood by and not done anything in Bosnia till well over 100,000 people were dead, had stood by and not done anything in Rwanda till 800,000 people were dead, said, well, by God, we're not going to have this happen a third watch. And even though there was not really any solid claim that what was, but the United States government was very careful to not say that it was genocide. Nevertheless, there was an intervention. But I should add, an intervention without the approval of the United Nations. It was done by the United States and by NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, so other European countries that are allies of the United States. And it was an air campaign that went on for 70 or 80 days and ultimately caused the Serbian government to back out. So what do we take from those situations that I've outlined from the 1990s? And I think what we could take from them, say as of the year 2000, is that this idea of genocide is actually not very helpful in terms of determining whether there's going to be a response. In Somalia, where there was no genocide, you did have an intervention, and it wasn't about genocide. In Rwanda, where you clearly had genocide and everyone knew it was genocide, you had no response. So without even going back and examining the terms of the Genocide Convention, we could start to think that, well, whatever it says, it doesn't give us much predictive power in determining whether countries are going to intervene or not. Same thing, Bosnia, Kosovo. Bosnia, really no intervention until very far into the situation, in spite of serious concerns about whether it was genocide or not. Kosovo, there was intervention, even though people were careful to say, well, it doesn't really look like it's genocide per se. Well, before I expand on that further, let me take a very short sidestep and bring back into the discussion this idea of crimes against humanity. Okay? Remember I said that in 1945, crimes against humanity was one of the crimes charged at Nuremberg, but the United States and other powers who created that concept were very careful to say that was only in connection with war. It didn't have to do with what governments did to their own people in outside of invading other countries. Well, over the course of time, through a very alchemical process by which international law is sometimes developed, i.e. the writings of professors and stuff, that the notion of crimes against humanity had expanded. And most people believed that crimes against humanity could be committed by a government in a time of peace inside its own territory. Okay? A very dramatic expansion. If you think about the Genocide Convention as taking this very narrow times and saying that's all that we're really concerned about inside someone's territory, now we're talking about large-scale attacks against civilians being a subject of international concern. And in 1998, a treaty was agreed to create an international criminal court, kind of a permanent Nuremberg. And one of the crimes that this international criminal court would have jurisdiction over, in addition to genocide, was crimes against humanity. And in that statute, which was agreed to by most of the countries of the world, and at least in terms of the definition of crimes against humanity, was agreed to by the United States, crimes against humanity committed in war or peace. So now we've reached the point where what a government does to its own citizens, at least in terms of massive violence, is very much an international issue. Okay? It's not just enough to say, well, it's inside our own territory, bug off. It's recognition that it is an international crime to kill civilians or to have widespread or systematic attacks against civilians without regard to your intent. Remember, this is much broader than genocide because you don't have to intend to destroy a group. You just have to be murdering people or in other forms of violence. I'm saying here because crimes against humanity can include torture, it can include rape, it can include disappearances, it can include enslavement and things like this. But violence against civilians on a large scale is an international crime. But despite that, that important development in international law, the question still remained, which was reflected basically in those events that I mentioned from the 1990s, and which goes back to the basic problem that was present in 1945. How do you resolve the dilemma or the conflict between sovereignty, because nations are still sovereign, they still have a presumptive right to their territorial integrity, and intervention to protect, at least in terms of human rights, to have some kind of forcible intervention into a country to stop massive human rights abuses. How do you resolve that dilemma? A lot of developments in the course of those years that suggesting that it is possible, that there is some basis for international or outside intervention on human rights bases, but still this concept of sovereignty is very important. And the UN Charter hasn't been changed. Remember, the UN Charter just recognizes two exceptions to territorial inviolability, and that is self-defense or UN Security Council protecting international peace and security. Well, and your watch is 10 minutes fast?
Yes.
So we're doing all right? Okay. Because I want to leave time for questions. Well, in the early part of this century, a group of respected wise people was organized by the Canadian government to address this issue of intervention and sovereignty and try to resolve this dilemma between protecting sovereignty but finding a basis for protecting civilians. And they came up with an idea that has been called, that's summed up in the phrase responsibility to protect. Responsibility to protect. And now it's become so current that it has an acronym, R2P. So you'll often hear people talking about R2P this, R2P that, okay? Well, this responsibility to protect has two components. One is the responsibility of governments to their own citizens. And the other is responsibility of the community of nations to civilians in any particular country. Okay? And in looking back over this history that I've run through of the last 60 years, what this commission suggested, and now has basically been endorsed by the members of the United Nations, what this commission suggested was that if you look at all of these developments, starting with the drafting of the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Genocide Convention and all of these different human rights norms that have been created, and development of the idea of crimes against humanity, that it now seems to be a norm, broadly accepted norm, that governments have a responsibility as part of sovereignty, that this is inherent in sovereignty. They have a responsibility to protect their citizens from genocide, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, this term that, from Yugoslavia, and serious war crimes. War crimes kind of being a little bit different category. And there's a man named David Sheffer, who was an official in the Clinton administration, has suggested that you could sum up those four things in the term atrocity crimes. So there's a responsibility of citizens to protect, or governments to protect their citizens from atrocity crimes. And that's derived from all of these different sources. And then they went a step further and they said that if a government fails to carry out, to fulfill that responsibility, that there is a residual responsibility on the part of the international community or the community of nations to protect civilians. And under certain circumstances, that justifies coercive intervention, armed intervention. That the sovereign responsibility to protect civilians, if it's violated, then means that the international community could act to fulfill its own responsibility. This is a very dramatic step forward in some ways. It's articulating in a lot of ways what was already out there, that is acceptance by governments of obligations, binding obligations under international law to protect their citizens from certain harms, massive human rights abuses. And that's pretty well established. I don't think that that much argument in theory as opposed to practice about the responsibility that governments have to their citizens, because they've signed on to these treaties. All of these different human rights treaties have most of the countries of the world involved. There are some who are isolated, but by and large, most countries have signed on to at least some of the human rights treaties, such that many of these broad standards are considered customary international law, so they bind countries even who haven't signed on. The second part is a little bit more of a stretch, the responsibility of the community of nations. And that I would break into two pieces. One is the question of, is the international community authorized to intervene? And that's probably pretty well established. The Security Council has now, in several cases, suggested that its authority to protect international purity includes responding to genocide or other types of mass violence, crimes against humanity. So you would find a fair amount of agreement that the community of nations can intervene. But that leaves the most important question to me, or the question that is most pressing with regard to Darfur, is must they intervene? Do they have an obligation to intervene? When you talk about a responsibility to protect, how strong is that responsibility? And that, I think, is the gap that we've come to. Because everyone recognizes, for the most, I say everyone, but for the most part, there's broad recognition that the Sudanese government is not fulfilling its responsibility to protect the citizens, the civilians in Darfur. And in fact, that was one of the key conclusions of this report on Monday. Well, I keep saying on Monday like it was a long time ago. It was yesterday. But it came out yesterday. This high-level commission came to the conclusion, which I think is obvious to everyone, that the Sudanese government is manifestly failing to fulfill its responsibility to protect. But what does that mean for the countries of the world? And I think that the bottom line is that although the community of nations have recognized that they may intervene to protect civilians, they have not accepted an obligation to do that, at least a legal obligation. And my contention would be that they're never going to accept a legal obligation, and that it's not ultimately a question of law, it is a question of politics. And whether and to what extent the United States, other governments, are going to respond to a situation like Darfur, or going to respond to Darfur itself, is a political question. And it depends upon, one, whether countries feel that they have some intrinsic interest in what is happening, or two, whether their populations, their publics, demand that they take action. And so that really brings me to the final part of my talk, which is the role of the public in stimulating responses to atrocity crimes, whether it's genocide or crimes against humanity. I don't think is really all that important. What we're talking about is human destruction on a massive scale, hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, I think that there's a reasonable basis to believe that Darfur meets the narrow definition of genocide. But you know what? To me, it doesn't matter. If 200,000 people have died, if 400,000 people have died, and there are 2 million lives hanging in the balance, I don't think it really matters if it's on the left side of the line or the right side of the line. That is atrocity on a mass scale, and that's the kind of thing that we need to respond to. And I think the good news that I can bring to you in the midst of what is a lot of bad news is that there has been this massive citizens movement in the United States about Darfur that is just remarkable in scale. 1 million, more than 1 million postcards were generated to President Bush about Darfur. And 1 million, as one of my colleagues said, 1 million of anything is a lot. There are students, and I know students here at Sonoma State have been involved in this now for a couple of, that's part of a much broader student movement all over the country that has put Darfur on the agenda of the United States. It hasn't solved the problem, but I am here to tell you that if there had not been the kind of citizen action that there has been over the course of the last 3 years on Darfur, the issue would have been nowhere for the United States. You may have noticed the United States has a number of other things on its plate that are distracting our leaders. But because of the constant citizen pressure, the United States has done much more on Darfur than actually any other country, and much more than it did on Bosnia for a very long time, and certainly much more than it did on Rwanda. We still have a lot to do, but I think that the thing that people are starting to become alert to is that it is a political issue, and that just naming something genocide, which the United States did in 2004, doesn't solve the problem. And just arguing over the terminology is not where efforts have to go. It has to go to pushing and pressuring and prodding governments to act. So the final thing that I want to show you is just suggest several things that you can do as citizens, and that we have to, that we have to do in order to ultimately have effective responses to atrocity crimes, genocide and other atrocity crimes. The first is keep informed. And one of the great things about the internet is that it's easier to stay informed about a place like Darfur than ever before. We don't have to depend upon reading the local paper or watching the local news, because if you did, you wouldn't even know Darfur existed, I'm sad to say. And that brings me to the second point, though, is that we can change that. I mean, oftentimes people who get involved on an issue like this focus their attention on the government, and that's actually going to be my third point, and that's important, but we also should spare a little time for the media, because they have a responsibility here, but they're not fulfilling their ability, and it's because they think people don't care. There's a very circular relationship between the media and the public, and they only want to cover things they think the public is interested in, but of course the public is only interested in the things that are being covered, and so that circle has got to be broken. And it can be broken by citizens who say, hey, this is serious. Why aren't you covering this? There are 2 million people whose lives are hanging in the balance. Why is it that you're not covering it? And I just saw a reference in 2006. In 2006, I believe this was for all of 2006. Maybe it was for some shorter period. But ABC News, this was in Nicholas Kristof's column this morning. ABC News devoted 11 minutes to Darfur and 23 minutes to the very, very important issue of the false confession in the Jean-Benet Ramsey murder case. And you just see that over and over again. The things that supposedly serious news outlets spend their time covering are of the utmost triviality, and things like Darfur don't get covered. So it's very important when outlets cover Darfur, thank them for it, because thanking is always very important. Same thing with your government representatives. If they're doing something extra, thank them. But then if they're not doing it, you need to spank them. This is political lingo, thank and spank. And both of those are very important techniques. So now I can't see my buttons. There we go. So the government, you need to let the government know that you care about this. It's very important. And we've seen, if you look back, if you plotted, I think there have been kind of surges in citizen activism. And if you plotted the surges in citizen activism with the surges in U.S. effort on Darfur, there would be a very close correlation. I'm very confident of that. Then supporting relief and education efforts is very important. Both of those things can't be done without resources. And then the final thing is to get engaged in community. Make this a community effort. We all have individual voices, but our voices are that much more powerful and effective if they're joined together. And being on a campus is just the perfect place to make it a community effort. The final thing that I just want to call your attention to is the website at the museum. I'm obviously not at the museum, but on that website, I have a weekly interview program called Voices on Genocide Prevention. A lot of it is devoted to Darfur, but it also deals with other issues, problem of genocide and mass violence. Have very interesting guests. Elie Wiesel has been on. Joey Cheek, the Olympic gold medalist, has been on. We have experts, we have government officials, we have activists, we have people who are on the ground in places such as Darfur or who have been on the ground. So if you go to that website, committeeonconscience.org, you can find Voices on Genocide Prevention, which is a weekly interview program. So with that, I'll ask for the lights, and I'll thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
We're going to take some questions. Okay, we're going to take some, can get involved. Okay? Yes?
Okay, yes. I'd like to have you expand a little bit. When you mentioned Jody Williams as the head of the commission who released the report yesterday, I happen to be deeply involved with her in the landmine campaign. And landmines now are considered a crime against humanity. They're very present. And it's important to note, I think, that our government is one of the countries that has not ratified the Ottawa Landmine Treaty of 1997. Just as we also, you mentioned the ICC, which our government has refused to participate in and has urged countries that have relationships with us to withdraw from the ICC because we are concerned that some officials in government, in the military, will be accused of the crimes against humanity and crimes against peace. And so there was just a law passed in Congress within the last few months that would absolve CIA and other military officials from being kind of exempting them by our standards, not by you. So I'd like you to comment on those, and then, just if I may, and then, as a person who's worked in Washington for 24 years and worked on Capitol Hill, in your list you have the government, as one of the areas to focus on. I would rather narrow it down to say your members of Congress, who you have clout with. As John Conyers once said, these members of Congress, you are their employers of last resort. Most people do not do citizen advocacy to affect Darfur, Iraq, whatever the issue, nuclear weaponry, landmines, and so forth. So I'd like you to please kind of expand a little bit.
Well, I'll deal with the last point first. And I think it is important. I mean, I say communicate with the government. I would include both the president and Congress in that. I think Congress is very significant. And in that regard, I would suggest that senators in a place like California, they may not come through here that often, but your congressional representatives come back on a regular basis, and they hold town hall meetings, they go on local radio and everything, and that's a good place to really get a hold of them. I mean, writing letters is important, making phone calls is important. If you have the opportunity to go to Washington, that can be important, but they come back to the district to find out what's on people's minds. And, they're taking a little mental tally. And if every time they have a town hall meeting, someone's standing up and asking about Darfur and pushing on Darfur, that gets tallied. And so that's very, very important. But I wouldn't let the president off the hook on that regard. But it is important to also work through the congressional representatives and get them to put pressure on the White House. In terms of the United States and its attitude towards human rights and human rights type, I'm not sure landmines would necessarily follow as a human rights treaty, but it's certainly along, in that number of human rights instruments. That could be the subject of a very long lecture. The United States has had very ambivalent relationship to almost every human rights instrument that has ever been written. They're often very, very involved. We, I should say, not they. We are very involved in writing and drafting, sometimes to great effect, sometimes to not so great effect. But then we don't like to be parties to them. We don't, we've got this sense of American exceptionalism. We've got higher standards and we've got better standards. And kind of a corollary to that, too, is that because of our particular position in the world, that people will try to use these things against us in the way that they don't try to use them against Sweden or Swaziland or whatever. And so that gets into a very complex issue of how the United States can exercise leadership but not obey the rules that we'd like to see everyone else obey. And maybe we're going to deal with that. But I could come back sometime and talk about that at great length. But it's a very important issue. The landmines is a good example. The International Criminal Court has been an example. And I should say, I think there's a tendency to look at the current administration as being different in that regard from other administrations. In some ways, they're different in degree, but they're not different necessarily in basic approach. For example, it was not the Bush administration, it was the Clinton administration that was in power when the landmines treaty was agreed to, and they didn't want to have anything to do with it. By the same token, with regard to the International Criminal Court, although Clinton ultimately signed the treaty, he made it clear that he had problems with it and that he would not recommend that the United States become a full party to it. You have to take extra steps to become a party. The Bush administration came in and had much more hostility, at least in its first 4 years. They've backed off on that a little bit, but this is something that goes from administration to administration. It's kind of deeply rooted in U.S. history and policy.
Okay. Any other questions? All right. Yes, David.
Early in your speech, you identified the date by which Germany was, but it was only some time later when historians looked at it that they were able to define that as World War II. It wasn't the World War when Germany invaded Poland.
Well, but it was a war.
It was a war, but it wasn't the so-called war.
Yeah.
History only discovered it was a World War, I don't know, a year So there's a tipping point. Somewhere there's a tipping point. And in the case of genocide, what defines that tipping point, and how do we sort of become alert to that tipping point that much earlier, so we become alarmed sooner rather than later?
Well, I think there are a couple of issues embedded in that question that are very important. The first is the existence of such a tipping point? Is there such a tipping point? Is its existence significant? And is the tipping point that we're concerned about when something goes from not being genocide to being genocide or something else? So kind of working back through those questions, the first thing I would say is, part of what I'm saying is we do have to kind of get away from this idea that whether something is genocide or not, because it turns out that's almost impossible to determine because of these arguments about definitions and stuff, and then because even finding that you've crossed that tipping point, which the United States government basically said as of September 2004, wherever the tipping point was, we've crossed it with Darfur, it didn't have that much impact. I mean, so actually finding the particular tipping is not that important. Now, with regard to this issue of genocide. Now, is there a time when a situation goes from having a lot of potentiality for violence to being mass violence? And the issue is obviously yes. Sometimes it's very obvious. In Rwanda, in April of 1994, you went from having a situation that was very tense, where there were massacres, to one where people were being murdered by the thousands per day. Well, that was a very clear tipping point, so to speak. But in other cases, it's a little bit less obvious. There's more of a gradual buildup. But you don't have to get very far into a situation of mass violence when you realize that there's something that's going on here that doesn't have an end, that there's no obvious ending point. For example, in Darfur had violence before 2003, but really from April of 2003 on, there was a sustained camp of civilians. And most of us didn't know it because it wasn't being covered in the press, but intelligence agencies knew it, the United Nations knew it. United Nations agencies knew it. So, where you've got a situation of organized violence that is targeting civilians on whatever scale you think is important. Do you think it's tens of thousands? Do you think it's hundreds of thousands? Do you think it's hundreds? I mean, most of us would say targeting civilians on tens of thousands is the scale that we're concerned about. Certainly hundreds of thousands, a scale we're concerned about. And when you're in that situation. It's not a question of knowing.
Okay, thank you very much, Jerry. Okay, so get your wallets and listen to your colleagues and students from the Human Rights Club who would like to talk to you just for a bit.
Hello, everyone. We are the Human Rights Club. I'm the co-president, Janelle Nelson.
I'm Carly.
And our club got started in 2004, April of 2004, especially after Jerry Fowler came to us about the genocide. And it's been our passion. We are the active citizens that he was talking about. We're trying to get informed, and we have made a lot of progress. When we first started tabling with our club, people had no idea where Darfur was, location-wise, what was going on, and now people are like, yeah, we're aware that there's a genocide. So we know that we're not in there, actually fighting this, but we are, doing what we can here to raise awareness. And we have been raising money, and every semester we raise about $500 profit that we send off to, originally it was SaveDarfur.org. They raised a lot of awareness, but this semester we're sending it to the Darfur Schools Project, which will be establishing schools in the neighboring countries since the kids there have been out of school for so long because of this genocide. And we have some events going on. We do our Darfur Awareness Campaign week every semester, and so it's going on right now. We tried to frame it around Jerry Fowler's lecture. We sell t-shirts like the ones you see us wearing, Stop Genocide in Sudan. They're $15. We take check or cash. And our club meets about 2 times every month. Our next meeting is on
The 26th. We have flyers up at the front if you want to join our email list, or if you just want to get more information about what's going on and what you can do to help. We have donations that are being passed around. Then we sell our t-shirts and bracelets also to raise money for the Peace and Development Fund.
And so just anything you can do to help. If you can't afford a shirt, if you want to come to a meeting and learn more, if you want to tell your friends about what's going on, anything you can do is helping this cause. Just appreciate you guys. And we are having our Chevy's night with our week-long campaign. It's going to kind of roll over till next week, next Tuesday after your class. If you guys all want to just meet up and go to Chevy's will donate 20% of your meal if you say you're eating on behalf of the Human Rights Club. And we also have flyers, so you can either bring in a flyer or tell them you're eating on behalf. And last year we had a really good turnout, and we're hoping that this year will be even better. So if you guys are interested, we hope that you would show up. It's in Santa Rosa, Chevy's. So, and that's it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Whatever it is, take some action. Every little bit counts. We're going to be tasked again from now on.